He was completely blind by the age of 7, orphaned by the time he was 14. He grew up profoundly poor in the segregated South. And yet, by the time he was in his 30s, Frank Sinatra, a man who, wasn't exactly known for tossing around casual compliments, was calling him the only true genius in show business.
Right, which is just a massive legacy to unpack. I mean, when you look at most cultural icons, you usually see a clear, linear path, right? They find a formula that works. They build a wall around their signature sound, and they just sort of stay safely within the property lines of what the industry expects.
Yeah, but then you look at the subject of today's deep dive, Ray Charles, and that whole architectural blueprint is just, well, it's torn to shreds. Okay, let's unpack this, because Ray Charles didn't just play within genres. He was like a musical architect who entirely ignored the zoning laws. He completely demolished the walls between gospel, blues, jazz, and country.
He really did.
And for you listening right now, the mission today isn't just to list off his Grammy Awards or his hit singles. We all know he's a legend.
Exactly. No, we have to go much deeper today. What's fascinating here is that we're looking at how this happened, how profound early traumas, combined with a ridiculously demanding, unconventional education, forged his ability to communicate raw human emotion in a way no one had ever really heard before. I mean, his sound wasn't an accident of nature. It was engineered under immense pressure.
So let's start with that pressure. We're talking about Greenville, Florida in the 1930s. I was reading through the source material on his early life, and the sheer volume of tragedy he faced before he even reached high school is just, it's difficult to process.
It really is. I mean, he's a toddler, and his musical curiosity is sparked by a neighbor, a man named Wiley Pittman, who played boogie-woogie on an old upright piano at a local cafe.
Right, but that spark is almost immediately suffocated by this unimaginable trauma.
Yeah, he was around 5 years old when he watched his younger brother, George, accidentally drown in their mother's laundry tub. Yeah, Ray tried to pull him out, but he simply wasn't strong enough. And the psychological weight of that was followed almost instantly by a physical darkness. He started developing severe issues with his eyes, likely undiagnosed glaucoma, and within 2 years, his vision was entirely gone.
Entirely gone by age 7, and then the final pillar of his childhood collapses. When he's 14, his mother dies. So he's blind, he's destitute, and he is entirely alone.
But before his mother passed, she did something that would fundamentally alter the course of music history. She relentlessly used whatever meager connections she had to get him admitted to the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine.
And that's really the turning point, right?
That decision is the catalyst for absolutely everything that follows. Because at this school, he isn't just learning to navigate the world without sight. He's being subjected to a rigorous classical musical education. And the mechanics of how a blind person learns to play complex classical pieces in the 1930s is just absolutely fascinating.
This part blew my mind. Because I think people assume, you just learn by ear, right? Someone plays a chord, you copy it. But he was actually reading and writing sheet music. How do you even read a musical score if you can't see the paper?
Well, you use Braille music, which is a painstakingly compartmentalized method. Think about standard sheet music for a piano. A sighted person can look at the page and see the treble clef for the right hand and the bass clef for the left hand simultaneously. Your brain processes both at once.
Right, you take it all in together.
Exactly. But Braille music doesn't allow for that.
Because your fingers are your eyes. You can't, read the page and strike the keys with the same hand at the same time.
Precisely. So his teacher, Mrs. Lawrence, taught him this incredibly demanding sequence. He would have to read the Braille score for the left-hand piano movements using his right hand. Then he would memorize that entire sequence.
Just the left-hand part.
Right. Next, he would swap. He'd read the Braille score for the right-hand movements using his left hand and memorize that. Only after he had fully internalized both separate parts could he sit back, mentally superimpose the two halves together, and physically play the piece with both hands.
That is just wild. Imagine trying to read one book with your left hand, type a completely different book with your right hand, and do it all in the dark from memory. The cognitive load required to do that is just staggering.
It's immense.
And he wasn't doing this with simple nursery rhymes. He was memorizing Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. How does that intense mental gymnastics actually shape the way he eventually writes his own music?
Well, it forces a complete hyper-internalization of the sound. He couldn't rely on a piece of paper to remind him of a chord progression. The entire architecture of the song had to live inside his head before his fingers ever touched the keys.
Oh.
And when you combine that intense, compartmentalized mental focus with the immense grief he was carrying from his childhood, you get a highly unique emotional delivery system. He had to channel all those complex feelings entirely into sound.
There's a quote in our sources from the musicologist Henry Pleasance that really stuck with me. He contrasts Ray Charles with someone like Frank Sinatra. Sinatra was a master of words. He can make you feel a lyric through phrasing and diction. But Pleasance argues Ray Charles became a master of sounds.
Because conventional vocabulary was completely inadequate to express the level of despair or exaltation that Ray Charles had experienced. I mean, words just weren't enough. So he bypasses the lyric entirely.
Right.
He uses this extraordinary assortment of slurs, glides, shrieks, wails, breaks, and falsettos. He couldn't just tell you he was in pain. He had to physically try out to you. Under stress, his voice would stretch over 3 octaves. It functioned as a literal pressure valve for his life.
So you have this teenager who is classically trained, mentally disciplined by Braille, and carrying this massive reservoir of trauma. He leaves Florida, completely uproots himself, and moves as far away as possible to Seattle, Washington in 1948.
Yeah, all the way across the country.
He starts playing the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. shifts at clubs. He even meets a 15-year-old Quincy Jones there. And slowly, the industry starts to catch on.
Right. By 1952, Atlantic Records sees the potential. They buy his contract from a smaller label called Swing Time Records.
And the price tag on that contract is just hilarious in hindsight.
Yeah.
$2,500.
Yeah.
I mean, even adjusted for inflation, it is the bargain of the century.
It really is, considering what happens next.
Yeah.
At Atlantic, he stops mimicking his early idols, like Nat King Cole, and starts forging something entirely unprecedented. And this is where we have to look at the actual mechanics of how he invented a new genre. Let's look at late 1954, when he records I've Got a Woman.
Okay, what is the actual musical recipe here? Because people say he invented soul music, but what does that practically mean in the recording studio?
Well, it means taking the sacred and colliding it with the profane. God, A Woman was actually a direct, reworked version of a gospel tune by the Southern Tones called It Must Be Jesus.
Okay.
In the black church, gospel music was designed to build a congregation to a spiritual frenzy. You have a driving 128 time signature, the aggressive tambourine on the backbeat, the call and response between the preacher and the choir. Ray Charles literally lifted that exact, escalating, frantic tempo and those sacred chord progressions.
But instead of singing about salvation and Jesus, he strips out the theology and replaces it with lyrics about Saturday night romance and worldly desires.
Exactly. He applies the mechanics of religious worship to the secular world.
That feels incredibly dangerous for the 1950s. You're taking solemn, sacred church music and turning it into the soundtrack for a rowdy juke joint. I mean, it's like taking a solemn church choir and making them the house band at a lively Saturday night bar. That had to alienate people.
Oh, it caused massive outrage. Gospel purists thought he was being sacrilegious, practically doing the devil's work.
Ooh.
Meanwhile, traditional R&B and blues purists thought the music sounded too holy, too chaotic.
Wow, so he's getting it from both sides.
Totally. But the tension he created by sitting right in the middle of those two extremes was magnetic. If we connect this to the bigger picture, people were shocked, but they couldn't stop listening. He gave birth to soul music by proving that spiritual ecstasy and romantic ecstasy sound exactly the same.
And the absolute zenith of this fusion happens in 1959 with, what'd I say? I was looking at the timeline of the song, and the wildest part is that there was no sheet music. It wasn't planned.
Not at all. It was pure, spontaneous creation. He was playing a show in a club. They'd burned through their entire set list, and there were still 12 minutes left on the clock.
Just trying to fill time.
Exactly. He turns to his backing vocalists, the Raylettes, and basically says, whatever I do, just follow me. He starts playing this infectious, Latin-tinged riff on a Wurlitzer electric piano, and then moves into this intensely suggestive call and response, moaning with the singers.
The atmosphere in that room must have been electric, but of course it was immediately banned by several radio stations for being too sexually explicit.
Yeah, but the bands didn't matter. It became his first top 10 pop record. He was laying the foundation for everything that would happen in rock and roll and soul for the next 2 decades.
You have to wonder, though, how does a guy who grew up entirely marginalized, who was just bought by Atlantic for pocket change a few years prior, suddenly decide he dictates the terms of the entire music industry? Because once he realizes he holds the keys to this new sound, his artistic vision demands business leverage. So in 1959, his contract with Atlantic is up, and ABC Records approaches him.
And the deal ABC offered was so mathematically unheard of that when Ray took it back to Atlantic to see if they would counter, the founders of Atlantic, Jerry Wexler and Ahmet Ertegun, literally looked at the paper and told him, if these people are sincere, you have to go with them. They couldn't even pretend to match it.
Break down the mechanics of this deal for us, because this isn't just about getting a bigger paycheck. This is about structural power.
Right. First, he secured a $50,000 annual advance. In 1959, for a black artist, that was astronomical. He also secured a profit split of 75 cents on the dollar, meaning he kept the vast majority of the revenue his music generated.
Which is huge.
But the most crucial element, the absolute holy grail of the music business, was that he demanded and won ownership of his master tapes.
Let's clarify why that matters so much. A lot of people hear owning your masters and just think it means keeping a copy of the tape on a shelf. But it's so much bigger than that. It's like paying a construction company to build a house, but the construction company gets to keep the deed forever, and they charge you rent to live in it.
That's a great way to put it.
In the music industry, the label usually owns the underlying original recordings. Every time that song is pressed to vinyl, played on a radio, or licensed for a commercial, the label holds the keys and takes the lion's share.
Exactly. Ray Charles demanded the deed to the house. He ensured that after a set period, the total control and ownership of his recordings reverted to him, not the executives.
To have that kind of foresight in the late 1950s is staggering. He trusted no one but himself. And with that total, unshakable creative and financial control, what does he do? He pivots entirely. He releases Georgia on My Mind in 1960, which sweeps the Grammys. But then, in 1962, he makes a move that genuinely makes no sense on paper. He releases an album called Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music,
featuring his legendary cover of the Don Gibson song, I Can't Stop Loving You.
Hold on. Here's where it gets really interesting. It is 1962. The American South is violently segregated. Civil rights protests are dominating the news. You are telling me a pioneering black R&B artist at the absolute height of his fame decides a country and Western album is a good career move? That sounds like commercial suicide. Why would he do that?
Because musically and narratively, Ray Charles recognized that country music and the blues are essentially cousins.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, both genres are built on working-class struggles, heartbreak, and storytelling. Charles understood that if he applied his jazz phrasing, his soul stylings, and large orchestral arrangements to these rural country standards, he could elevate them.
So he's proving that emotional resonance doesn't care about genre boundaries, or racial boundaries for that matter.
Exactly. It was a massive cultural risk, but the math checked out. I Can't Stop Loving Him. You topped both the pop and R&B charts for weeks. He essentially integrated American music genres during a time when integrating a lunch counter could get you arrested. He brought country music into the mainstream pop consciousness in a way no white country artist had managed to do at that time.
We have this image building of a man who is an invincible negotiator, a musical genius who sees connections no one else sees, and an artist in total control of his destiny. But when you look at the source material detailing his private life, there is a massive, incredibly dark shadow running parallel to all of this success.
There is. The control he exercised in the boardroom and the studio did not extend to his personal life. For 17 years, Ray Charles fought a severe heroin addiction. He actually started using when he was just 16 years old, right around the time he was hustling in clubs in Florida and Seattle.
Which means throughout the entire invention of soul music, throughout the genius negotiations with ABC, he was managing a full-blown opioid addiction while touring globally. The sheer logistics of hiding that are terrifying.
It really is, and it eventually caught up with him. As his fame grew, the insulation around him grew, but the addiction deepened. It culminated in a massive turning point, which was a Halloween 1964 arrest at Boston's Logan Airport for possession of heroin.
He was facing significant prison time for this, right?
He was. To avoid prison, he agreed to enter a rehabilitative facility in California. And he didn't gently taper off. He endured a brutal 4-day cold turkey withdrawal.
Oh, wow.
The judge ultimately gave him a suspended sentence and probation, largely because his psychiatrist testified to his absolute determination to stay clean. He kicked a 17-year heroin habit cold turkey.
The willpower required for that is unimaginable. And how does he respond to the media circus surrounding his admission and rehab? He immediately goes back into the studio and records 2 songs, I Don't Need No Doctor and Let's Go Get Stoned. It is such a defiant reclamation of his own narrative.
He refused to be a victim of his own story. But his complexities didn't end with addiction. This raises an important question about his legacy because his political actions were full of fascinating paradoxes. Yep. In 1961, he was scheduled to play a show in Augusta, Georgia. He found out the dance floor was strictly segregated. White attendees on the main floor, Black attendees restricted to the balcony. Charles flat out refused to play, canceled the show, and willingly took a $757 fine for breach of contract.
A massive public financial hit to protest segregation. But then you roll the clock forward 20 years to 1981, and he faces intense international backlash for choosing to perform at the Sun City Resort in South Africa during the height of the apartheid boycott.
Right, and he defended the decision by arguing that his music would force the audience of black and white fans to integrate while he was there.
It shows a man who operated entirely by his own internal logic, regardless of public opinion or political expectations. He didn't conform to anyone's idea of who he was supposed to be.
Exactly.
Which brings up a detail in the research that I absolutely love because it perfectly illustrates that internal logic and his need for total control. His hobby. He was obsessed with chess.
He was. He actually learned the game from his psychiatrist, Dr. Hacker, while he was in rehab in California. He played on a specially designed pegboard with raised squares and holes for the pieces so he could feel the layout of the entire board.
There's this great anecdote where someone asks him if people ever tried to cheat him because he was blind. And he gives this incredibly sharp, humorous response. He says, "You can't cheat in chess. I'm going to see that."
He took it incredibly seriously. He even played a match against Larry Evans, an American chess grandmaster. Now, Charles lost the match, naturally, but Evans noted that Charles actually spotted a complex tactical trap that Evans had set. He wasn't just moving pieces, he was genuinely calculating multiple moves ahead.
So what does this all mean? When you look at the chessboard, the ABC business negotiations, the ability to kick a 17-year heroin addiction cold turkey, you realize Ray Charles was the ultimate master of compartmentalization.
Absolutely.
He was a man who funded millions of dollars for hearing disorder research through his foundation, who fundamentally changed civil rights through his art, and who fathered 12 children with 9 different women. He was chaotic, disciplined, agonizing, and ecstatic all at once.
And knowing about those personal struggles, those demons, it doesn't diminish his art. If anything, it gives you the context for the raw, undeniable pain you hear in his voice. The pressure valve had to release somewhere.
You cannot separate the agony from the ecstasy in his music. It's all the same fabric. Ray Charles passed away in 2004 from liver failure, but the final chapter of his life is a testament to the sheer endurance of his talent. His final album, Genius Loves Company, was released posthumously, and it absolutely swept the industry.
It won 8 Grammy Awards, bringing his lifetime total to 17 Grammys out of 37 nominations. He received a U.S. postal stamp in his honor. But perhaps the most poetic piece of his legacy happened in 1979.
Oh, the state song.
Yeah, the state of Georgia, the exact same state where he refused to play the segregated hall in Augusta and was sued for it, officially named his rendition of Georgia on My Mind as the state song.
From being banned in the state for demanding equality to having his voice represent the state forever. It's incredible. So as you reflect on all of this today, why does this deep dive matter? Beyond just learning music history, Ray Charles is living proof that the boundaries we accept as absolute truth are often just illusions, whether it's the genre of music you're supposed to play, the physical limitations of your own body, or the standard business practices of a ruthless industry.
He proved that those walls are just waiting to be shattered by someone with enough vision and the audacity to demand more.
And that leads us to a final thought I want you to mull over. Think back to that ABC Records contract. In today's era, modern pop megastars are still fighting tooth and nail against industry machinery. You have massive artists today spending years re-recording their entire back catalogs just to gain ownership of their master tapes.
Yep.
Ray Charles secured his in the late 1950s. If a blind black man in the pre-civil rights era, carrying the weight of childhood trauma and addiction, could outcalculate and outnegotiate the entire entrenched music industry, what impossible barriers in your own life or your own industry are you simply accepting? It's just the way things are. Remember the architect we talked about at the beginning? Maybe it's time you started ignoring the zoning laws.